Every hit television show has two stories, the one they broadcast on Tuesday nights and the one nobody was supposed to find out about. The A-Team gave America car chases, gold chains, catchphrases, and explosions that never seemed to kill anyone. But the real wreckage happened off camera, in trailers, in contract negotiations, and in the long silences between actors who had stopped trusting each other entirely. Four men built one of the most watched action series in television history, and that very success became the thing that tore them apart. What really happened behind the scenes of the A-Team goes deeper than anything they ever put on screen, and it started before most fans even noticed something was wrong. Stephen J. Cannell didn't walk into NBC in 1982 with a television show. He walked in with a dare. Four Vietnam veterans, wrongly accused of a crime they didn't commit, living outside the law but righting wrongs for ordinary people who had no one else to call. The network suits weren't convinced at first, but Cannell had a reputation for making unreasonable ideas work, and NBC eventually gave him the green light. What followed was a casting process that looked straightforward from the outside and was anything but, because what the show required wasn't just talent. It needed personalities big enough to carry pure attitude for 60 minutes every week and make it feel effortless. George Peppard brought serious Hollywood weight to Colonel John Hannibal Smith. His silver hair, his controlled authority on camera, and roughly 3 decades of film experience made him the obvious anchor for the series. What nobody addressed during casting was how completely Peppard intended to be that anchor, not just on screen but in every room, on every decision, at every level of production. Dirk Benedict, cast as Templeton Face Peck, arrived with natural charm and a comedic instinct that lit up every scene he walked into. Dwight Schultz secured the role of H.M. Murdoch by walking into his audition and becoming genuinely unhinged in the most entertaining way possible, outclassing every safer candidate on the producer's list with sheer invention. Then there was Mr. T, born Lawrence Tureau, and his presence on that set shifted the entire direction of the show before the first season finished broadcasting. B.A. Baracus was never written to become a cultural force. Children started shaving their heads into mohawks. I Pity the Fool stopped being a line of scripted dialogue and embedded itself into the national vocabulary as naturally as breathing. His face appeared on cereal boxes, lunch boxes, and his own animated series, and NBC quickly understood that the man wearing all those gold chains was the primary reason millions of people came back every Tuesday night. That realization is what ignited the conflict with Peppard, a battle for screen dominance that would define the entire run of the show and survive long past its cancellation. Peppard had spent decades operating on the assumption that he was the leading man in any production he joined. He had shared the screen with Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's. He arrived at the A-Team with the authority of a film actor who had crossed into television on his own terms, expecting the kind of professional deference that his resume had always generated. Television doesn't honor that currency for long. When ratings data confirmed that Mr. T was driving viewership more than anyone else in the cast, Peppard received it as a personal insult rather than a business reality. Directors began fielding complaints that read less like creative notes and more like territorial warnings. Scripts came back with Peppard's handwriting, redistributing lines to ensure Hannibal always delivered the final word in every scene that carried any weight. The two men stopped speaking directly to each other sometime around the second season, and what remained between them was a Cold War managed entirely by intermediaries. Dirk Benedict, who sat in the middle of this every single working day, later described the atmosphere as navigating a minefield of silence and side glances, which is a restrained way of saying that two professional adults had to be handled like opposing parties who couldn't safely occupy the same space. Producers stopped attempting to resolve anything and focused entirely on containment. Scenes were shot twice on certain days, once featuring Peppard and once featuring Mr. T, purely to limit the amount of time they spent sharing a frame. The crew, according to insiders who worked those long shooting days, ran informal wagers on which of the two would crack first, because the tension had become so routine it had turned into its own form of daily entertainment. Money accelerated every existing crack in the foundation. Both Peppard and Mr. T renegotiated their deals as the show's numbers kept climbing. And when Peppard learned that Mr. T's revised contract paid more than his own, the reaction traveled several floors above the production office before it stopped. Shouting matches in Peppard's trailer became something the crew prepared for rather than reacted to, because the surprise had long since worn off. NBC sent executives down with bonuses and carefully worded reassurances, quieted things enough to get through another run of episodes, and then watched the same argument resurface wearing slightly different details. the wounds never fully sealed. Benedict absorbed pressure from both directions throughout all of this, and the scripts gave him little to work with. Face was popular and consistently underwritten because the writers had determined that audiences came for Papard's gravity and Mr. T's magnetism, and Face occupied the territory between them without generating additional complications. By the third season, Benedict was openly frustrated that his character had been reduced to comic relief with no real development. He brought suggestions to the table, pitched new directions for Face, and found those conversations tended to end without resolution. The show's internal politics consumed whatever energy the writers might have invested in a character who wasn't actively threatening to walk off set. Dwight Schultz managed to stay clear of the worst collisions, but the role itself extracted a different kind of cost. Murdoch required sustained unpredictability, a level of manic comic energy that didn't simply switch off between takes or after long shooting days. Schultz has spoken since about struggling to separate himself from the character, about the difficulty of turning off that frequency after years of maintaining it at full volume. The pressures were quieter than the Peppard and Mr. T confrontations, but they ran deeper and lasted longer, accumulating across 5 seasons in ways nobody discussed on set. Melinda Kulea arrived as reporter Amy Allen, having been pitched the role as the team's 5th member, a character with real standing and genuine narrative purpose. Peppard's opposition to that framing was persistent and open. His resistance to sharing prominence with a female lead was not handled quietly, and the producers, who needed him cooperative far more urgently than they needed Kulea's arc to develop, eventually accommodated his position. Her role contracted through the first season and ended early in the second, acknowledged on screen with just enough ceremony to avoid ignoring it entirely. Kulea reflected afterward that the experience was a direct lesson in how network television could close a door on talent without explanation, regardless of what anyone had promised during development. By the 4th season, the wear showed in the episodes themselves. Stories cycled through familiar beats. The no-kill policy that once gave the show its particular playful logic now felt like a creative limitation the writers kept colliding with. And competing series like Miami Vice were offering audiences something more grounded and more willing to examine consequences honestly. The A-Team's format had been its greatest asset, and it had quietly become a ceiling. Writers attempting to refresh the scripts were working against a cast that had fractured too deeply to discover any new collective rhythm. Mr. T's personal toll during this period emerged gradually, first through tabloid rumors, and then through far more candid interviews given years later. The production schedule, the promotional obligations, the sustained pressure of maintaining a persona the public had decided was permanent and non-negotiable, all of it converged simultaneously. He began arriving to set visibly depleted. Production delays became standard rather than exceptional, and producers held quiet internal discussions about deploying body doubles for action sequences just to prevent the schedule from unraveling entirely. He pushed through regardless, partly from professional discipline and partly from an understanding that children looked at B.A. Baracus the way you look at something that cannot be allowed to fail. That kind of expectation doesn't release when the director calls cut. It follows the person home and stays there. NBC's response to a series losing its grip was to introduce new characters for the 5th season. Robert Vaughn joined as General Hunt Stockwell, and Eddie Velez came aboard as Frankie Dishpan Man Santana, a mechanic and explosive specialist meant to bring younger energy and new storylines. Neither move produced what the network needed. Velez has said since that he never managed to penetrate the bond shared by the original 4, that there was a particular warmth between those actors, even amid all their documented hostility toward each other, that he couldn't access from the outside. Longtime fans rejected Frankie almost immediately, and the ratings reflected it, confirming what everyone on set already knew. The chemistry that had powered the show had dissolved, and casting decisions couldn't manufacture it retroactively. The final stretch of episodes ran like a series that had already made its peace with ending. Peppard was talking to his agent about other projects. Mr. T had stopped hiding how completely exhausted he was. Benedict's spin-off pitches went unanswered, and Schultz was already transitioning into voice acting, where a different and longer career had begun taking shape. Cast and crew talked about the early years with the particular tenderness that surfaces when people have accepted that something is already over, and memory is the most honest version of it left. After the cameras stopped for good, everyone moved in directions that reflected exactly who they were beneath all the noise. Peppard searched for roles that could match what Hannibal had given him, appeared in guest spots in television films across the late 80s and early 90s, and died in 1994, leaving behind a legacy as one of the most commanding presences in the history of American action television, and one of its most complicated personalities. Benedict embraced his identity as a cult figure without apology, returned to science fiction with the Battlestar Galactica revival, wrote about his experiences with uncommon candor, and became a reliable presence at fan conventions, where he joked about the van with the ease of someone who had made peace with what it meant. Schultz built a voice acting career in animation and video games that sustained him for decades, with work in Star Trek: The Next Generation and dozens of other productions that kept him creatively active long after his A-Team years had faded from the headlines. Mr. T faced cancer after the show's end, turned that fight into a platform for motivational speaking aimed at young people, and proved in public that the resilience he performed on screen was something he genuinely carried when real life tested it. The catchphrases stayed, the style stayed outrageous, and the person behind B.A. Baracus turned out to be more durable than any character a television writer could have constructed. Cooley moved into writing, producing, and painting, building a professional life shaped by her own choices, rather than by what any network executive decided her role was worth. The show found new audiences in syndication and through streaming, one generation after another discovering the black van, the impossible plans, and the four personalities who couldn't coexist peacefully but kept showing up for each other anyway. Cast members reunited at conventions, traded stories, laughed at the chaos, and found that the old bitterness had softened into something more layered and more honest. The particular feeling that comes from looking back at something that cost you real things and still meant everything. The A-Team was never a clean story, not on screen and definitely not off it. It ran on friction and adrenaline and four people who were genuinely difficult together. And that friction turned out to be exactly what made 40 years of fans unable to let it go.